the son of an architect who wanted to be a screenwriter, so I fulfilled his fantasies. And I actually grew up in Italy, of all places, and I have friends from Italy in the house right there, family visiting. And it's his birthday, my friend Francis.
That's another good reason for choosing Waterworld. I couldn't pass it up on doing something on my birthday.
You know, it's interesting, you mentioned 35 years, so that's an important number, but in fact, I wrote it even before that. The original draft of this was 1986. I wrote it on the very first model Macintosh, and then I sort of set it aside for a few years because I was pursuing some directing, actually. I directed a couple of low-budget movies. And then I dusted it off in 1989, did a quick rewrite, and it sold. And, then they started making a movie 5 years later in 1995 is when it actually hit the screens.
That's absolutely wild. So let's say, where are you when you find out that it's sold, and then what's it like finding out that Kevin Costner gets attached to it? What's that?
So that was much later. I actually should tell you the origin story because it's amusing. So I was in my 20s. I was 26. I was hustling and trying to break into the movie business, and I had some friends who worked at Roger Corman's company, and I had a meeting with a guy named Brad Cravoy, who was gone on to produce some Farrelly Brothers movies, but at that time he was just like a hustler, just like me. He was trying to produce, and he said to me, Peter, I have some South African money. If you write me a Mad Max ripoff, I'll let you direct it. So I had two moral questions facing me at that point, that juncture. One was, do I take the South African blood money for the chance to write? Because it was pre-apartheid. And unfortunately, the answer to that question was yes. However, was I willing to write another Mad Max ripoff? And everyone was doing that at the time. It was just, that's the cheapest way to make an action movie. You just get a bunch of beat-up cars, 3 barrels of gasoline and some guns, go to the desert and make a movie. They would make them in a weekend. There were hundreds of them, and they were being sold at the American film market. And it just felt thankless, and it wouldn't be anything that I would want for that. So I was walking around the marina in LA, and it just sort of hit me like an epiphany. Let's just set it on water. Let's just, change the genre by making that one change. And I went in to pitch Brad Cravoy with my brilliant Eureka. And I think the number that he had in mind for the budget of his movie was $100,000. So I said, we're going to set it on water. He goes, are you ready to have a movie, Peter? A movie like that? That'll go $5 million to make. So we parted ways, and I said, it's a good idea. I'm going to write it anyway. So I wrote it on spec. But back to that question that I posed earlier, it is a Western, and it is based on, do we have any guesses?
Shane?
Shane. Who said Shane? Yeah, Shane. Especially the friendship between the lone cowboy and the young kid. And in the case of Shane, it was a little boy. But I very much took that as a template. I thought that was just a strong movie. The mysterious guy with a past, with a history, with violence, with trauma, with who knows what happened to him, and yet beneath all that, he's got a heart, and the little girl brings him, out essentially. And one of the biggest compliments that I have received from people is women in their 30s who have seen this movie say, "Oh my God, I was so glad to see that type of a role model. I was so sick of the Disney princesses, and here's this really tough, fierce, cool girl, and her performance is so good, who, tames the wild beast, and brings out his heart." So that's the origin story.
And in your original drafts too, you really were provided some great female characters. There were a lot more than needed up on the screen. And you can probably find on YouTube first, what are some of the things that made it to screen that like you're glad, you know, made it all the way through? But then tell us about some of the world that was envisioned before changes were made and other writers came on board.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is this sort of hodgepodge feeling to this movie, and that's because of the nature of Hollywood development hell, especially when you make a movie of this scale. It was briefly, probably for about 5 minutes, the most expensive movie ever made, at $180 million back in '95. So that was a lot of money, but it was very quickly eclipsed. But essentially, when these movies are developed, I was so naive, I was so green, I was in my 20s. I didn't realize that, you know, they were going to write this thing into the ground, hire 5 more writers, and then just keep making it kind of worse. The most heartbreaking moment for me was about a month before production. One of the producers, Chuck Gordon, Larry's brother, took me out to lunch and he said, Peter, you know, we still don't have a script that's as good as your original spec script. And I'm like, oh my God, can't you just shoot it? And he said, no, the train has left the station. We built sets or whatever. And that's a little bit heartbreaking to hear, but it is the nature of movies of this scale and Hollywood. And what happens is it gets so eclectic and sort of weird. Like, what's up with that kind of chitty bang floating device that just shows up Deus Ex Machina, you know, and they can't even do a wide shot of it. It's just so bizarre. Like, that's a weird thing. And even though I loved David Twohy, you know, was the largest contributing writer, so in the arbitration, the Writers Guild co-awarded a screenwriting, or whatever, written by credit. He came up with the whole idea of smokers and that the fact that they would always be smoking, but where do they get the cigarettes from? Like, that's always been a little bit of a head scratcher for me. And so there's a lot of things that are sort of odd and bizarre, and then certain things were repurposed. Like, for instance, that was not the way I used the Exxon Valdez. I used it completely differently. In fact, it was mystical and amazing, and it was, I'm not going to say more than that because, well, something's coming. But it was a completely different use of that very big element. And Kevin Reynolds had a conversation with me, you know, when Kevin Costner came aboard, I had done 7 drafts or so, and they kept saying, make it grittier, make it darker, make it more cyberpunk. I was like, what's cyberpunk? and it was kind of like losing that I had, you know, in the original. And what did I know? I was just, you know, trying to, finally, the way that I found out that Costner was attached is I had a friend, another writer who had a deal at Universal, and she was driving along in one of those golf carts to get to her office or whatever, and she passed Costner talking to this other person in a suit. And as she passed, she heard one word, Waterworld. And she called me up, she goes, is Kevin Costner attached to Waterworld? And I said, I don't know. I called my agent, which was CIA at the time, and I said, you know, Ken, is Costner attached to Waterworld? He goes, how did you find that out? It's like, yes, he had decided that he was interested in that movie, and then of course, he brings in his team, which includes his writers, and in this case, Kevin Reynolds. I heard at one point that he turned down Robert Zemeckis to direct this, which is another little bit of a heartbreak. That would have been an interesting movie. Kevin Reynolds, of course, he had worked with him a lot, and he knew he could control him, and he kind of took over the movie, and, you know, did all that stuff. But I had a lot more epigenesis in my original script. Like, they have the gills and the web beat and stuff, but there was all sorts of really interesting mutations that were happening that I sort of...
No, yeah, that sounds like a much more fantastical and like fun, like world that could be explored. They did create one extension of the movie, which was, of course, the theme park show over at Universal Studios. And much in the same way that time for writers for compensation with the theme park show.
Yeah, a year or two after the movie was released, we were approached by the Writers Guild, who said, you know, we'd like to essentially sue Universal on your behalf. Are you willing to do that? We think that we can get you compensated for the theme park use of your material. Myself and David too, you know, and it ended up being a 5-year arbitration, and they argued, for those of you that know the way the Writers Guild works, you assign your copyright. When you sell a movie in Hollywood, you have to release your copyright. However, there are certain reserved rights that are called separated rights that the original writer, the credited writer retains. Book publishing, dramatic adaptations of theater, and some merchandising rights. And they said, we think that essentially the stunt show is a dramatic adaptation of the movie. It's the same characters, it's the same story, it's the same stakes, it's, you know, the setting, all of it is the same. So we prevailed, and they threw a bucket of money to try to avoid that, but they, you know, made a settlement with us, and then we established that precedent. So from now on, any writer whose movie is made into a theme park attraction gets a minimum guarantee, and, you know, you could argue, you can negotiate about that. If you have clout, if your last name is Crichton or Spielberg, you're going to get more than the minimum. And also, you know, that's another myth that I would like to disabuse. It's more or less being disabused. That Waterworld was a flop. It is so not a flop. It's actually one of the most valuable movies in the Universal catalog because of the theme park revenues. So if you do the math, this has been running at 4 theme parks for 25 years, 365 days a year, at least 12 shows a day, and the arenas seat 3,000. So that's 30 million people who've seen, you know, who've been exposed to this title. So that's a lot of revenue. They've gotten a lot out of this title. So I'm proud of that, and I'm also proud that now writers get paid for theme parks.
Is there any of the outside of Universal over here, or like have you gone to like the zone? Like, they created a whole land.
Yeah, I have not visited. Has anyone been to a Universal theme park? Not the Hollywood one. Over there. Did you go to the Waterworld ride? Where?
I didn't go to the ride, but I've been to one in Orlando.
And do they have the Waterworld attraction there?
I don't think they did for time, because this was like 20 years ago.
I don't think that one has it, but I think it's in Osaka. It's in Beijing. It might be in Singapore. And in Beijing, what's interesting is that instead of just the stunt show in the, you know, the arena, they actually have a whole Waterworld zone, which includes like a cantina where you can get food, and then there's a souvenir shop. You know, the Waterworld, so you're entering Waterworld land, and that's unheard of for a one-title franchise. You know, that's usually Transformers or Jurassic World or whatever, or Harry Potter. You know, you get 8, 9 titles, and then you create a zone. But in this case, and I think it has to do with the fact that this myth has kind of like really captured people's imagination. You know, and of course it's based on the flood myth. You know, it's something that is so baked into our storytelling DNA. I mean, we all probably have some visceral, ancestral, traumatic memory of something like this kind of happening at one point. You know, and I think that in certain cultures, perhaps China being one of them, there's a real thirst for, you know, for this story in this world. So they made a zone.
Now, we're gonna take some questions in just a little bit. I'll give you some time to think about your questions. You know, think of some good ones. Be classy and don't be weird. And if you have to think about it, you know, maybe err on the side of caution. Let's see. Do you want to talk about anything that you might be working on coming up, or do you want me to save that for after we've taken some audience questions?
Well, if you ask, okay. So we have actually reacquired the copyright for Waterworld. something with it, especially a title like this where they haven't done anything with it. So we were approached by an attorney who specializes in this, and as of March 27th this year, we got the rights back, and we are developing a book called Waterworld Reborn.
Woo! Ah.
Are there any projections on when we might be able to expect be able to put that on our show?
Say it again?
Are there any projections on when we might be able to get that on our show, on our bookshelf?
Oh, bookshelf. So when is it going to be out? No, we don't know that yet. But,
I worded that weird. What did I warn you about?
oh, but I do want to give proper credit for that idea. So I told you a story before the screening that my wife had seen the movie before me. She said it's not my kind of film. And one of the, I mean, we have slightly different sensibilities, and certainly at that time I was very squarely in my overachieving ego. And she was saying that there was a certain misogyny to the movie, and there is. It's kind of like, okay, that's the nature of the character a little bit. But Paula, for years, has been telling me, you've got to do something with this title. You've got to resurrect this title. And she came up with the idea, well, I think you can guess where this is going. Who's the lead in the movie? Nola. Nola. She's now in her 30s, and she's got some things to say. And that was Paula's idea, and we developed the story together. And I'm really excited about it.
Woo!
Does Paula want to give a little recognition? Anyways, now I'll take it to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? I'll go over now over to you.
Oh, yes. Hi. How long did it take to write your first draft?
So this is going to sound surprising, but this is the nature of beginner's mind and fearlessness. 3 weeks. It just poured out of me. That's because I didn't know the rules, and I didn't know all the rules, and I'm great. I think he's coming around. I did visit the set. That was a really interesting experience. The set was filmed off the Big Island of Hawaii, off the West Coast, and just prior to production, that whole atoll, which, Kevin Reynolds wanted it to be gritty and rusty and real, and making the movie saying, you got any advice on shooting on water? And Spielberg said, don't shoot on water. He just don't do it. Whatever, shoot as much as you can in a tank or on a stage, do green screen. This was, by the way, all those effects are practical, and there's no drones. Those are helicopters doing those aerial shots. All those explosions, real to scale. No CGI, no digital. So Spielberg says, don't shoot on water. And for some reason, Kevin Reynolds decided to not listen to the most successful director of all time. So they were going to shoot it practically. And they built that whole atoll. It was a practical set. And there was a hurricane, and it sank. One of the reasons why the budget started to balloon. But another reason is, to create the sense of being surrounded by water, you have to sail far from shore, with all these boats. You have to sail a couple of miles or whatever to have a feeling of, being 360 degrees of water. That means there's the picture boat, there's the camera boat, there's the catering boat, there's the bathroom, there's the hair and makeup boat, there's the prop boat, like all this whole flotilla, which to mobilize and get out there with safety. And so even if you have a 6 a.m. call time, you're not getting your first shot until like noon. And then they would get, 4 setups, and that would be it. And then, the one shot they would get was the money shot, the sunset shot. Like, let's get that shot. The silhouette of the boat. There's a lot of beautiful shots like that. But it ends up being this kind of like slightly ugly movie because the sun is mostly overhead. And that's the nature. So here I was, young, naive, idealistic screenwriter visiting the set, and I'm maybe 3 weeks into production, and they're like, I don't even know how this math works, but I think they were four. Like, you're the asshole who wrote this thing? I was really getting a lot of glares, and also there was all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Costumer's marriage was falling apart, and there were scandals. So it was a bit of a tense set when I visited it, but it was kind of fun. Who else?
So I'm going to try to rein in this question a little bit, but I loved hearing how difficult it was to make this, because I think now where Hollywood is, everything is so easy and efficient. Like, it's all about how quick can we do it, and it kind of relates to AI's question, I guess. I write myself, not screenplays, but I taught a dramatic writing class to high school students. The question is, how much do you think the industry has changed? And what advice do you have to young screenwriters?
Let's see. Okay, so one is, I'm going to start with the last. The genie is out of the bottle on AI. The sooner you embrace it, the better off you're going to be, because it's not going away, and it doesn't have to be an enemy. It could actually be quite a powerful ally. I use AI all the time right now. I'm not having AI do my writing, but it's doing my research, I'm bouncing ideas. It's like I have a writer's room. I have a really good collaborator. AI is a really powerful tool, and it's getting better all the time. And there's a whole bunch to choose from right now. I think it's very much worth exploring AI. In terms of production, it's also abandoned a plan to spend $800 million building the whole production facility in the South. I think it was in Georgia, because it's like, we don't need production facilities anymore. So much of this movie could have been digitally created, brilliantly. And in fact, I mentioned Zemeckis earlier. It was just a few years after this movie that he did Castaway. And those gigantic ocean waves at night were digital. All that water movement, was just a few years after, could have saved so much money on this movie. So that's the inevitable direction the business is going in. And there is a lot of skittishness and fear, obviously, for all of us, creators and also actors. It's like extras, forget about it. You don't need extras anymore. And even leading, actors, movie stars are now considering making avatars and licensing, their performance rights. So it's kind of a crazy new world, but it's here and it's not going away. So let's figure out how to do that dance, in a way that maintains our creativity and vision.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I was also appreciative that you brought up the fact that Kevin Costner's relationship was kind of hanging by a thread, but because of, you work with the actors, because you have the
Events, and we just look at each other and kind of like roll our eyes. It's like, what a crazy ride that was, I don't think anyone's career was made by this, or actually the crew. Everyone who worked on this movie ended up like buying homes and all sorts of things, because it was a really long production. In terms of the above the line, not so much. I think it's interesting. There was so much writing at the time, calling it like Fish Star or Kevin's Gate, or all these like disparaging comments about what a flop it was, and that was insane for Costner's career. Costner's doing just fine, as we know, and it ends up being kind of a iconic kind of cult classic that I think we
part of the movie that you that came out of the movie as a writer? Something that like really stood out?
Um, you know, I like the moment when Enola opens the music box and says, "I'm home." To me, that's a very touching moment, and I was, wondering whether that landed, this idea, like, what's the mythology, the Enola mythology. It was written in much more detail and granularity in various drafts, and I've always wondered, how clear it is. Like, can someone tell me exactly what happened to Enola? I'm not sure. Perhaps the ones who've watched it 10 times can, but I think that's a very interesting moment, because it's like, it's on multiple levels, what that means, that moment of returning home. And, there's a moment that's missing, that I sort of miss, which is, what is that island? Yeah, it's Everest. And how do you know that? Yeah. Okay. So, that should have been in there, because that's really kind of cinches that's the sort of, Planet of the Apes, Statue of Liberty moment, right? Which is like, oh wow, that's what that is. And the, underwater sequence is a little bit of a throwaway, like, what is that? Is that New York? Like, why couldn't we have shown what that was more specifically? I thought that, Eiffel Tower, show me. In fact, I think I wrote it. Something more iconic. Yeah, I love him up on the mast, and that was a helicopter shot, not a drone shot. And I also, I have to say, I love what they did with the Universal logo. I had thought of doing stuff like that, myself. Like, how can you really get into visual? How can you nail? And the first scene, the urination, is that really sets up the world visually, and without any words, you know exactly what the stakes are. He's got to drink home, and then he's got to share it with his plant. Okay, now I get it. Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Does my friend Bob want to ask a question? Oh, that's a great question. And I want to shout out, thank you so much, Cody, for inviting me and for this event, because it was such a treat to see. This is a DCP, this is a digital print. It was beautiful up on that screen. I did a screening event earlier this year at Quentin Tarantino's theater, the Vista, in LA, and they literally projected a VHS copy. So I was like, oh my God. So it was so nice to see it, but I did see it 3 months ago. Correct. He's a screenwriter, by the way. I really enjoyed this screening event. I think it's because I'm here with friends and family and some old friends, and I just let myself sort of get swept up in the film. I didn't feel pain, I felt joy. Yes. Of course, more people will join. In fact, that's a big part of the next book. Yes. first of all, I was so naive when I first sold the script and then started the rewriting process. I didn't even know that I was in development hell. And I had no idea that I could be fired and replaced. When they started, I would turn in, draft 4, and, Andy Lick and Jeff Miller, two of the executive producers who were the guys that I knew who ended up getting the script first to John Davis and then to Larry Gordon, said, I think they like your work. There's no talk of you being replaced. And I was like, what are you guys talking about? I'm the writer. I had no idea that they go through writers like you're talking about a style. They just writer du jour. And then the specialist on dialogue, specialist on women, specialist on this. The script doctor guy, Joss Whedon, uncredited, and spent tons of time in Hawaii here. It was a bit of a whirlwind, to be completely honest. My head was spinning. And by the time this whole thing, and then it became, this huge production, and I visited the set, and everyone was giving me evil eyes, and then going to the premiere. It was just a bizarre sort of rites of passage thing. And I think I'm still recovering from it.
With the success of the Universal attractions around the world and the summers or the mega movie summer celebration with Jaws 50th anniversary next to 75 and Back to the Future 40th anniversary next to 5, we have 1995 Waterworld. Why do you think Universal hasn't really done much with the property for over just the stud shows?
Exactly as I speak. I don't know. It baffles me. It baffles me. Clearly, I mean, the truth is that most decision making in Hollywood is fear-based. It's what is going to not get me fired. What can we do that's a carbon copy of what we did last year? Let's follow the playbook. Let's do it all from the ego and the formulas, as opposed to the true creativity, which is all your intuition and your gut, I don't. It kind of baffles me. Like it begs to be remade. I think people were so worried about production, the idea of doing the whole water thing. But for a while they were thinking about doing a TV series, and certainly the technology has gotten to the point where it's much more feasible to make a movie like this. But we need them to play ball and to resurrect this, and we actually need all of you. We want to, with Waterworld Reborn, we want to make more than just a popcorn movie or revive the franchise. We're going to start with a book, because that's something that we do control. We do have publishing rights worldwide, but Universal owns overseas rights to Waterworld, and therefore we need them to play ball, and we're going to make it irresistible, hopefully. And one of the things we want to do is use this movie, which is essentially a popcorn movie, to raise awareness about our oceans, make it a movement more than a movie, talk about water as a human right, get Matt Damon and Water.org on board to do something. Maybe he executive produces it or something, but we want to do something very big and very grassroots driven, so we'll see. I think there's writing a book, so that's step one, but hopefully we can do something collectively that really brings out the full potential of what this whole world and movie could be.
Have you considered creating a video game to help you to that end?
That's a great idea, and that's another thing, like, why don't you make a video game? Especially now with the technology, the immersive technology, so I would say stay tuned for that too.
Yeah, I just also want to bring attention to the question of the same teacher. She said, did you have advice to young writers?
Advice to young writers. Okay. so I mentioned the sort of beginner's luck, the beginner's mind, right? Fearlessness, like not just diving in, writing so quickly that it wasn't even me, it just happened, right? That is a gift and it's a blessing. It's bigger than me. What happened after that was I froze. Then it was like, oh, now we want your next script. Well, what do I want to say? What's my voice? What matters to me? That it wasn't totally clear. So it begins with this idea of, know thyself. What's going on in your world? What are you burning to express? And what are the emotions associated with that? And then it doesn't necessarily mean you have to write about your life, but you have to write about the emotional stakes that you know, right? And then you can translate them into sci-fi universe, whatever you want. But the interactions, there's a story. If you really are a writer, and actually we all have stories to tell, but if you want to express it in written words, then spend time. There's a great book, The Artist's Way, right? Julia Cameron, which is a process to try to help you find what it is that you're here to express. So do the things that nurture that voice, and then you got to be a little fearless and just go for it and let go of perfectionism. Those are my 2 cents.
Trying to remember this as easy as possible, but, so, I know you mentioned the VHS screen, and then there's digital, and there's also a fan cut of the movie, and all the rewrites. Was your original concept with the map tattoo true to how they actually iterated on screen?
Okay, that is one of the biggest disasters in the movie. I hate that so much. I hate that so much. It's so stupid. And it's so, talk about this, it's machina. It's worse than the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang Blood movies. It's like just in the moment of time when we're at 2 hours and 10 minutes of screen time, he's going to figure out, oh, north and south, oh, there's it's there, flies. Like, give me a freaking break. I hate that so much. And when I write, I need verisimilitude, like a semblance of it being plausible scientifically. And I spent so much time figuring out that map. At one point there was an eclipse, there was a telescope on the supertanker. They were looking to see the little, I don't want to go into it, but it was much more granular and realish, just the idea of a few numbers and a symbol and then suddenly it's upside down. I hate that. It needed to be a lot better.
Yeah, well, the rumor I heard was up on the actual design.
What's that?
An intern messed up on the design, and it's like a mixture of conviews that doesn't make any sense.
It's possible. And the other thing that I really don't like is it seems like there's all these copies of the maps. So then why did you just so.
Well, I guess that's why they left out the ending of it being Everest, because it didn't make any sense for the actual map.
Right. Yeah. That could be.
Well, before we go, I have one more question in case. You touched on a little bit about the climate aspect about the story. Could you tell us a little bit about like how this has inspired talks on climate? I believe you were invited to the UN to speak on.
I was. There's been some real life scientific kind of developments based on this story. So one of them was that Kevin Costner, at one point we described, so the idea that the pirates had, the sluggers had the supertanker and the oil was in there was not in the original. In the original they were skimming oil. There was some oil gurgling up from the ocean floor and they were skimming it. And Costner was fascinated by that. He ended up developing, investing in a startup that salvaged ocean spill up. So it was skimmers and then centrifuges that would separate the oil from the water. And they actually deployed them several times, I think successfully. I'm not sure what's happening with that company right now, but anyway, he was inspired to actually take real life conservation action. And then in 2019, I was invited to the United Nations by a National Geographic reporter who was helping moderate a roundtable on the idea of floating cities as a possible solution for habitat loss due to climate change and rising oceans. So, for instance, in a country like Bangladesh, if the ocean rises 5 feet, we have 10 or 20 million climate refugees. Like, what are you going to do with them? And so the United Nations convened this roundtable. They hired some heavy-duty futurists, engineers, architects. This guy, Bjarke Engel, who's a pretty well-known Danish architect, conceived of a whole master plan of modular floating cities. There was a model, there was 3D modeling, and the Nat Geo moderator says, Peter, you want to come along? And you were the guy who was writing about this in 1986. I'm like, sure. And he said, hey, after Bjarke's presentation, I'm going to feed you the first question. You would offer that? I said, sure. So Bjarke does his presentation, and it's very impressive. And at the end of it, he says, so as you see, this is very well thought out. It is not a disaster like Kevin Costner's Waterworld. And the reporter goes, Peter, you want to comment on that? And I said, I bet you didn't know that the screenwriter of Waterworld was being Bjarke.
Well, I think it's that time tonight. Are there any parting words you want to give everyone?
Well, thanks so much for showing up. It's such a treat. I really appreciate the passion. At first, it was so disorienting, this experience, like, what did I create? What is this monster? And then realizing that people really do have a love and affection for the film. It means a lot to see it, like, in a setting like this. And I want you guys to stay for the ride, the next iteration, because we're going to hopefully make something even cooler.
Peter Rader,